World Magazine, which in the World News Group, World Magazine has been around a couple of decades now, I think, and they do an excellent job of covering culture and the Christian movement in America, and also do some reporting of the general news from a biblical worldview. And he and Marvin Olasky, who's also been a guest of ours many times, have co-authored a book called Prodigal Press, Confronting the Anti-Christian Bias of the American News Media. And Warren joins us now, I'm assuming from Charlotte. Warren?
That's correct.
You there?
Yep, I am. I'm in Charlotte. It's great to be with both of you guys. Thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. I asked you this last time. I've forgotten. The World Magazine's been around how long now?
Well, this is our 28th year. We've celebrated 27 birthdays, so we're in the middle of our 28th year right now. Joel Bells founded the magazine, and as you rightly said, Marvin Olasky is our editor-in-chief. I'm the associate publisher of, and Mindy Bells. We have a lot of people with a lot of editor and publisher titles, but Mindy Bells edits the magazine on a day-to-day basis, and Marvin sets the overall editorial direction for the magazine.
To what do you attribute your staying power and success? Because when you first came out, World Magazine, I'm talking about, you had it was basically a Christian version of a news magazine like Time, Newsweek, etc., U.S. News and World Report, and and here we are 28 years later, and you guys are still going, and that's, how do you explain that?
Well, we've got some really passionate subscribers, and I think that that's a big part of it. They have stuck with us through thick and thin. In fact, I will tell you that I was in Houston just yesterday, had to change planes. I was at a weekend conference and had to come home, was changing planes in Houston, and I saw a guy with a World Magazine. First time, I've got to confess, it's the first time I've ever seen one of our readers with a World Magazine in an airport. You usually see them with Glamour magazine or whatever, kind of crazy, But, so when I saw the magazine, I said, "Forgive me, I gotta ask because I noticed you're reading World Magazine, and I work for World Magazine." And it was like I had met a long lost friend. He was, he stopped what he was doing. He wanted to ask me a bunch of questions about the magazine, and we just had a nice 6, 7, 8 minute chat in the Houston airport. And Tim, that happens to me wherever I go. Is that when people find out I work for World Magazine, they just want to stop me. They want to ask, about our writers and how we do what we do. And I just feel really blessed to be a part of an organization like World that generates such a passionate and positive response for our readers. And I think that that's the reason that we've been around. And we've got, while a lot of people are dropping their subscriptions to magazines, they're saying, well, I can watch television or I can get it on the internet. I think our readers feel a real connection to a mission, and they know that by subscribing to World Magazine, they're really supporting that mission.
Prodigal Press, tell us about it.
Well, if you know the story of the prodigal son, you know that that son had a godly father, a good man for a father, and yet he rebelled against that godly heritage and squandered his fortune. The good news about the story of the prodigal son is that he eventually came back and his father received him again. The Prodigal Press we're not so sure about, but one of the things that we do know about the Prodigal Press is that it also had a godly heritage. When I talk about this book around the country, I often start with the story of the New York Times. Most people don't realize that the New York Times was founded in 1851 by a man named Henry Raymond, who was a Bible-believing Presbyterian layman. And in the 1870s, the New York Times had an investigative reporter named Augustus St. Clair. And Augustus St. Clair went undercover in the abortion facilities of New York City, in much the same way that Lila Rose and James O'Keefe today are taking video cameras into Planned Parenthood facilities. And the abortionists that were exposed by Augustus St. Clair in the New York Times in the 1870s were put out of business, and one of those abortionists actually spent 7 years in prison. I tell that story to make this point that just like the prodigal son, the Prodigal Press in our country today had a godly and mostly Christian heritage. But over many years, it has squandered that Christian heritage. And what Prodigal Press does, the book Prodigal Press, that Marvin Olasky and I have written, is to document that history, try to explain why the American news media has taken this liberal and anti-Christian turn, but also to say what we can do about it. And to ask the question, is there a possibility of recovery, and what would that recovery and redemption look like?
Warren, this book is a revised and updated version of the book. Was first published in 1988. It seems to me, and I think it seems to a lot of people, that this anti-Christian bias in the American news media has gotten worse in the last 25 years. Is that in fact the case?
Well, we think it is the case. In 1988, when Marvin Olasky originally published that book, the only real cable news network was CNN. And now we have, of course, this proliferation of news networks. And, of course, we have Fox News and a few others that are on the conservative side of things. But the overwhelming majority of the new cable networks, MSNBC, CNBC, and others, are more on the liberal side of things. We also have the Internet. The Internet was just, I sometimes jokingly say, the Internet was just a gleam in Al Gore's eye in 1988. Al Gore, of course, famously claimed to have invented the Internet, which he did not. But so we've had the rise of the Internet, and you guys in television, in radio, know what's going on in radio. We've had some new regulations, some deregulation, but some new regulations in radio. There are many more radio stations than there were in 1988. So there's been this tremendous proliferation of media, and most of this media is more liberal than it was. It's gotten to the point where back in the 60s and 70s, the media at least pretended to be objective. They were liberal. Most journalists were liberal. In fact, 85% of Columbia Journalism School undergraduates self-identify as liberal, and that's pretty much always been the case. But they try to hide their liberal and anti-Christian bias in their news reports. Today, we've gotten to the point where they don't even try to hide it, where you've got news networks like MSNBC that are blatantly liberal and pretty much proud of it and say so on the air.
Yeah, Warren, we're talking to Warren Smith of World Magazine, co-author of the book Prodigal Press, Confronting the Anti-Christian Bias of the American News Media. What is it that they can't stand about us? By they, I'm using a broad term, I know they, but I'm talking about the secular liberal news media in America. We're just, by we I mean, I'm talking about basically conservative Christians. What is it that they just can't stand about us?
Well, I think I think there's two or three things at work here, and we discuss, in fact, we've got an entire chapter in the Prodigal Press that we call Spiking the Spiritual. Back in the day, whenever, a writer or reporter would turn his copy in, turn his story into an editor, the editor, would edit the story, would mark it all up, and if it was a good story, would push the story along to typesetting. But if it was a bad story, or if the editor wanted to kill it for some reason, there would be a spike on the editor's desk, and he would impale that story on the spike, and that was called spiking a story or killing a story. We've got a chapter called Spiking the Spiritual, and I do think that one of the things that we have to understand as Christians is that, that the war, the fight is with powers and principalities, and that there is a real spiritual warfare, a real spiritual fight going on here. And I think that non-Christians are going to be antagonistic towards the gospel because there's a spiritual war going on even for their very souls. And I think that sometimes that bias is a public reaction to a private, personal struggle that goes on in all of our hearts, but which unfortunately in many cases secular mainstream journalists have made that decision against Christianity, and so it sort of plays out in the way they live. But I think there's also another reason that is, just kind of the way the world has evolved, where the liberals and folks in the mainstream media, they just live in a bubble where they only know the people that they know. I mentioned to you a moment ago that 85% of undergraduates at the Columbia Journalism School are self-identify as liberals. Gallup has been doing a study since the 1940s in which Gallup asked a simple question: have you attended a religious service in the past 7 days? If you ask the American people that question, the number has remained fairly consistent at around 40%. If you ask journalists, that number is less than 10%, usually around 8 or 9%. So it's journalists, mainstream journalists, just don't know Christians. They don't understand the Christian perspective. They tend to be tone deaf when it comes to the issues that Christians care about. And so they write about what they know, and what they know typically is to look for sources that are anti-Christian or non-Christian, and they might not even, in some cases, know that. They just simply don't know any Christian sources.
Warren, given this environment, if there's a young person who wants to go into Christian media, whether it's written media or whether it's the internet or whether it's TV or radio, if someone wants to make their way into what we tend to call mainstream media and they're a Christian, do you counsel them to keep their Christianity under wraps until they have a position and their career firmly established, or is there some other way to do it?
Well, I do not counsel young people to put their Christianity under wraps, and I do counsel young people every day to go into the mainstream media if that's where the greatest opportunities for them are. One of the other effects of all of these changes that we were talking about a few minutes ago, these changes in technology, these changes in regulation that has allowed the proliferation of radio and television stations, is that I also think that there are great opportunities for young people in journalism today. We often hear the mainstream media bemoan the decline of the daily newspaper, and it is a fact that the daily newspaper in America is in pretty serious decline. But journalism overall is not. There are more jobs overall in journalism today than there have ever been. This is, I think, could potentially be a golden age for journalism in this country. I think we absolutely need Christians in the field of journalism. When I look at the Bible, I see journalism in the Bible from beginning to end. In Genesis chapter 2, God told Adam to name the animals, and in Revelation, Jesus told John to write down what you see. This is what journalism is. Journalism names the animals, and reporting is all about writing down what you see. So I think of journalism as a godly, biblical vocation. I actively encourage young people to go into it. I don't think they need to hide their Christianity, and I would counsel them to, if God is calling you to that, get yourself trained, and find yourself some good mentors in journalism, both that understand the craft of journalism, but also who have a solid Christian worldview, and just pursue that vocation with passion.
Talking to Warren Smith, co-author with Marvin Olasky of the book Prodigal Press, Confronting the Anti-Christian Bias of the American News Media.